Okay, good to be here. Whoop, we don't need this. I found a history of teaching. Oh, but I found a history of teaching math. If you want a copy, it's my email address is Rosenshine at uiuc.edu. History of teaching math. Teaching math in 1950. A logger sells a truckload of lumber for $100. His cost of production is 4/5 of the price. What is his profit? 1960. A logger sells a truckload of lumber for $100. His cost of production is 4/5 of the price, or $80. What is his profit? Teaching math in 1970. A logger exchanges a set L of lumber for a set M of money. The cardinality of set M is $100. Each element is worth $1. The cost C of production contains 20 fewer points than set M. Represent the set C as a subset of set M and answer the following question. What is the cardinality of the set P of profits? 1980. A logger sells a truckload of lumber for $100. His cost of production is $80. His profit is $20. Your assignment, underline the number 20. Teaching math in 1990. By cutting down beautiful forest trees, the logger makes $20. What do you think of his way of making a living? How did the forest birds and squirrels feel as the logger cut down the trees? Teaching math in 2000. A logger sells a truckload of lumber for $100. His cost of production is $120. How does Arthur Anderson determine that his profit is $60? I'll wait for it. I'm going to begin with an overview of what's been going on in research for the last 35 years. Well, not quite yet, but it's what we're at. Get to the top. I brought Kathy is serving as my PowerPoint. This is one step. Okay. After 50 years of heavily funded research, there is no stable consensus regarding best teaching practice. There's no common body of knowledge. There are no common standards of practice. At one pole, we have romantic ideas of children joyfully teaching themselves. These ideas have been expressed in whole language experience, open education, discovery learning, child-centered education, hands-on experiences, and constructivism. At the other pole, we have the results of empirical research results that have shown the advantage of instructional support and systematic instruction. In her last book, The Academic Achievement Challenge, Jean Shaw said that in reading, this romantic view, and romantic is her term, is imbued with love and hope. This view holds that a child learns to read as naturally as he learns to speak, if only we encourage him to use his language and his cognition when he reads interesting books. But sadly, she wrote, this view has been proven by research, theory, and practice to be less effective than a code emphasis, particularly for children who are at risk for learning to read. This conflict between a romantic approach to instruction and an empirical approach to instruction is not a question to be decided, Jean said, by more research. It's not the research, she said. The results of the research on beginning reading have been the same since the 1920s. The problem is getting people to accept the results. of the research. But I believe, sadly, that the vast majority of academics in curriculum and in teacher education will not accept research results that conflict with their romantic, sentimental, child-centered ideology. In her last book, Academic Achievement Challenge, Jean said that teacher-centered learning, which we're going to be talking about, is particularly effective for those who enter school with limited knowledge, language, experience, and skill, regardless of social class. The traditional teacher-centered education works for children with learning difficulties because it provides more structure and more direct instruction than does a progressive child-centered approach. If children who lag behind are not given the additional instruction they need to continue to make progress, they will fall further behind in each successive grade. The teacher-centered education works for children with learning difficulties because it provides more structure, more support, and more systematic instruction than does a progressive, so-called child-centered approach. This instructional support includes providing children with prompts, scaffolds, and guided practice. This support includes sequencing material so that confusion is minimized, practicing new material in small steps, and providing for sufficient practice and mastery. If there is any learning style that is supported by the research, it is that naive learners profit when they receive a great deal of instructional support. But it is unfortunate that these very supports and scaffolds are rejected by romantics in their misguided cause of helping children. The losers in this conflict are children from less advantaged families. This is a perpetual problem, and I'm going to sort of give a history now of what's gone on in this romantic and pragmatic conflict for the last 35 years. In 1962 to 1965, they had the national government, federal government sponsored the first grade reading study. The purpose was to determine which of a number of methods are most effective for teaching reading in the first grade. They used standardized tests in them all. There were language experience approaches. Whole language wasn't invented. That was the precursor of whole language. There was sight reading, and there were various phonics approaches. The results, okay, the results were published, the results were published by Jean Shaw in sort of her major book, 1965, The Great Debate, where she said clearly, phonics approach, systematic instruction, was clearly more effective than the whole language experience approaches. Okay, done, we're settled, everything's fine now, down one, please. So by 1970, we threw out the phonics and substituted open classrooms, where kids were going from station to station and teaching themselves. Okay, down one more. Sometime in the 1970s, the principals decided to put the walls back up. And walls, because of the noise and the confusion and because it wasn't working, the walls were put back. I still go in school sometime where these sort of temporary walls are still up. Okay, so next one. Yeah. The 1971 to 1979 was a very exciting period in educational research. Bob Ebert, who was then at the Office of Education, decided to have a truly national experiment on follow-through. And so he instituted what was called follow-through planned variation, in which 7 or 8 different models for teaching were compared, all of them in follow-through, grades 1 through 3. One of the models was the DISTAR model, called Direct Instruction or Oregon. One of the models was another phonics approach. One of the models was Bank Street. One of the models was Arizona, which was a more open thing. There was this cognitive model in Ypsilanti. So there was a comparison of 8 different models. And the results were published in 1979, and Mary Kennedy summarized them in Educational Researcher in 1970, whichever year, 78. Okay. They found, once again, that the phonics approaches were more effective for teaching decoding in grades 1 through 3. In terms of comprehension, slightly better, but not significantly so. Okay? So now we have the second big study. Phonics comes out as being superior. Okay? Okay. Down one more. While all this is going on, there was another pragmatic movement going on in American schools, which was the teacher effects research. My name is associated with this: Jerry Brophy, Dave Berliner, Jane Stallings, Carolyn Evertson. This was, and I'm going to be talking a good deal about this, this was an approach to first identify those teachers whose students made the highest progress during the year as measured by standardized tests, to identify those teachers whose students made the least progress, and talk about how did they differ. So this was a research that focused only on the schools, that focused on real life teachers and what they learned. And the research ended in 1979 and has not been continued until a recent study that came out in 2001, which I will be talking about in Milwaukee. But that was one empirical period. Mm-hmm. Okay. Oh. Another period, and this both of the other presenters have been talking about, from 1980 to 1992, this is when the cognitive strategies, those that are in Kalzoff's, those that are particularly in your volumes, the Kalzoff material and the Ellis material, are all on what, and I'll be talking about that, what strategies could be developed that will help kids develop their learning. So this period was going on in that period. Down one more. All of it? Yeah. And from 1980 to 1992, there was a third strand of empirically based research. This was the comparisons of internal processing, expert novices, and schema theory, and how we process knowledge. And so we have these 3 strands, which went on until about 1990, which focused on one on teachers, one on cognitive strategies, and one on simply basic information processing. And I'm going to be talking about all 3. In fact, all 3 are summarized in my paper and in the attached paper. And the reason I say convergent, as we'll talk about, is the results of all 3 fit together. There's really no conflict. Okay, but that's going on. Next. That's it. Stop there. Cover it up, cover the bottom of it. Okay. Despite Gene Schall's book, despite the first year study, and certainly despite the follow-through results, in 1987, California threw out phonics and mandated for the whole state whole language. I had a question yesterday saying, how do you feel about state legislatures mandating educational practice? Not too hot. How do you feel about the state of California, this is the education department in the state of California, mandating whole language? Not too hot either, okay. This is the romantic view that Gene Schall was talking about. This is a very dominant movement, and they threw out and they mandated whole language. The state of Colorado mandated whole language. The Education Department. The state of Arizona mandated whole language. Next. Also in 1987 was the birth of another part of the Romantic constructivist movement. The National Council for Teachers of Math came out with their standards, which really were ideas of, and here we went again to discovery, constructivist approaches in the teaching of math. And so we really have right here three trends in American education. We have the phonics, the systematic teaching of reading. We have in many ways, I think, because they were all research-based, the cognitive stuff in the cognitive strategy, the effective teaching and others. And we have the romantic, which comes out with the constructivist stuff in whole language and in math. And these three movements are still clearly bouncing around today and are affecting the students, the students that come out of the colleges today and those that appear in the schools. Next. One of the more exciting studies, and I hope to talk more about that, is the cognitive apprenticeship study of Collins, Brown, and Newman. This fits with the scaffolding, the notion that we're training students in cognition. Next. In 1990, Marilyn Adams publishes Beginning to Read, a survey of the research on teaching of reading since Jean Shaw's book in 1965. And what did she find? She found that the phonics approach is what was supported by the research. Okay, so this is 3 years after the thing. Okay, next. You might want to move the whole thing up now. In 1990, at an IRA meeting, Ken Goodman calls Marilyn Adams a vampire because she threatens the literacy of American youth. And he said, because she's a vampire, she has to be killed with a silver dagger. You don't believe I said it? Go to Google, punch in Ken Goodman, vampire. There it is. Even though the research supported Marilyn Adams, the leader of the Romantic movement, certainly the leader of the whole language movement, Ken Goodman, decides that regardless of the research, Marilyn Adams, who wrote this research book, should be thrown out. Next, please. Move it up a little more so they can see it. Here comes another review. In Review of Ed Research, Steve Stahl reviews the research on basic reading, again looking at more of the experimental studies. Again, phonics comes out. Again, more schools are mandated whole language. Next. By 1995, however, scores had deteriorated enough in California that they said, well, let's bring back phonics. And so the state of now, the Board of Education decides to put in what they call a balanced approach to reading. There was this wonderful book, volume by the American Federation of Teachers on beginning reading, an issue on beginning reading, which I recommend to you. And next. By 2002, California said, this is now, that they are only going, you can use any basal you want, but the state's only going to pay for 2 of them. And one of them was well known, the open court reading series. So Ken Goodman, he of Marilyn Adams fame, says, nothing less than an inquisition is being raged by federal law against teachers and school administrators to limit their practice to mandated applications of officially sanctioned research findings and rooting out heretical whole language practice, a term that is being used for all. Ken Goodman is complaining that what he did to others is being done to him. Okay. There's the history. And what I see in the history, of course, are these two balances, these three that go back and forth, one supporting this romantic view, which expresses itself in hands-on, and the other supporting the more research-based support. Okay. Now, can we say that, no, but at the same time, okay, the romantics are claiming that they do have a research basis for what they claim. Okay? And they are saying that research on how people learn is what supports their position. And the problem is that research on how people learn is ambiguous. And the implication, I'm sorry. The research on how people learn is unambiguous. It's clear, and I'll be giving you two examples. They're very clear. The problem is when you write down the implications of that research for practice, then you can go either way. Okay? Let's give an example. The research says that we are highly rational people who act as rationally as we can with new information. No doubt. An example of this rationality are misconceptions. For example, many people share the misconception that the reason it is warmer in summer is because the Earth is nearer to the sun in summer. That's a misconception. It's the tilt, but it's rational to come up with that. And they use the misconception literature to say we are being as rational as we can. Okay. No argument about that. The question is, what are the educational implications of this rationality? One group, the romantics, say, therefore, put children in settings where they can construct their own knowledge and where they can let this rationality spring forth. Other people say, put children in settings where they won't make misconceptions, where they won't construct errors, you see. And here we have people, here's where the phonics approach comes in. Okay? And so the two movements rest upon the same basic research. But how you respond to the problem that people are rational, to misconceptions, can go either way. Let me give another example. The research is very clear that you don't simply take in what I have to say word for word. You don't take in what you read word for word. We don't take in anything. We construct a meaning in our heads. Okay? We use our background knowledge to construct meaning. Therefore, the less background knowledge you have, the less you're able to construct meaning. This background knowledge is sometimes called schema. So what are the implications of the fact that we use background knowledge to construct meaning? One group, and this is John Bransford and his people, say, therefore, put students in situations where they can construct meaning. Another group, and they're primarily led by E.D. Hirsch, says, since background knowledge is so important, let's directly teach background knowledge. And out of that we come the core knowledge program. So here we have the same basic research on schema and on constructing knowledge, the fact that we are rational and we do construct knowledge, leading to directly opposite instructional implications. One group saying let's put kids in certain settings, and the other one says let's provide more control. And this is what's happening and what will continue to happen in the conflict back and forth between the two movements. And today, to some extent, clearly with phonics, the more structured approach is in ascendancy. But if you listen to the majority of people in colleges of education, as I do, and you listen to their criticism, and you see the teachers who are coming out, I don't know if it's ever going to happen. But there we are. Okay. This is sort of the end of part one. What I'm going to say is that the research on cognitive processing. Oh, by the way, someone was telling me that they're in preschool and these people have these learning stations that they go to and they're not very happy with it. And I said, yeah, the research does not support those learning stations. And I might as well repeat it now. The research strongly supports beginning reading instruction as early as possible. In fact, there was a preschool program in Chicago that had reading instruction before grade 4, in age 4 and 5 as sort of a variant of follow-through. And these kids were followed, and they were superior in achievement to the other kids through grade 6. And I'm going to talk later on about successful schools, and most of them began teaching reading in kindergarten. And when I visited some of these schools in September, the kids were reading. I mean, they could decode fluently. Because I was, they let me go. I just grabbed books off the shelf and said, have you seen this before? No. Can you read it? And they did it. So there's a tremendous case to be made for beginning this, particularly for all kids, for beginning, particularly for kids who don't come from rich environmentally homes, for beginning this instruction as early as possible. Yeah, and we talk about that on the panel, but yes, tremendous support. Okay, cognitive processing. Okay. Now, my point here is that if we never did classroom research and only looked at the cognitive processing research, you could make a case for teaching in small steps, for providing support, for review, for processing, for many of the things that we hold dear. And this point is summarized in the paper, in my paper, which I handed out there. And I'm one who likes to read a play after I've seen it, not before. So what I'm hoping to do now is to give you an overview, an introduction to the paper, which, given that I've been revising this paper for 10 years, is starting to get into shape. So it's getting pretty useful now. So there it is. Okay. There is no underestimating the importance of background knowledge. Simon and Hayes wrote, "There is no substitute for learning the prerequisite knowledge if one is to solve a problem." If we look at the differences between experts and novices, a major difference is the extent of their background knowledge, the overlearning of their background knowledge, and the connections between pieces of their background knowledge. Che and Shi wrote in 1980, and there's no reason to change that today. How do you create experts? The most obvious answer is practice. Thousands of hours of practice. For the most part, practice is the best predictor of performance. Practice can produce a storage of patterns and a set of strategies. It's easier to learn new material, to work on new material, when you have the background knowledge. Much of what I'm going to be saying, much of what has been said at this conference is easier for you to assimilate because you have background knowledge in this topic. By meaningful information, we mean someone has connections. Someone has the internal connections between these pieces. Okay? Now, a major difference between experts and novices is that the knowledge of the experts is in, as we say, meaningful chunks, meaningful pieces. If a chess player looks at a chessboard, they can memorize it quickly, so that novices look at the chessboard and, don't memorize it. How have they memorized the position of 32 pieces on the board? That's a lot of things. What they see is patterns. And what they're memorizing is 4, 5, 6 patterns. Okay? How do we know that? Because when they show the same chess masters a board randomized and ask them to recall what they saw, they can only recall about 7 pieces. So the difference then is that when they have patterns, chunks, they can do more. What comes through education, what comes through learning is the development of these patterns. And the more patterns you have, then the easier it is to use them for higher level thinking in your area. Okay? Our working memory can only handle a few pieces at a time. 7. For some it goes up, for some it goes down. Once I could handle 11. Now I watch it drops a little bit every year. I think I'm down to 5 now. If a telephone number, it used to be 12 digits didn't bother me. Now any more than 5, and I got to write it down. That's the limits of our working memory is in pieces. The advantage of expertise is that they have been able to chunk. I used to teach U.S. history, and you say for me, you say the Reconstruction period, and it chunks just a whole large array of that. So the difference between experts and novices, one is, of course, that experts have more information. Okay? Secondly, it's better organized. Okay, they have automated. They have more chunks. Experts understand the big picture because they can identify particular instances in this problem, whereas novices have the smaller pieces. Now, are experts better in higher level thinking? Because people say we have to teach kids higher level thinking. Well, let's think about that. Okay? They did a study. They found professors of cardiology, and they gave them problems, and they thought aloud as they solved them. And then they had students, medical students, also in cardiology or in the cardiology class. They gave them problems and had them talk about it. Clearly, the cardiology problems saw chunks. Their thought processes were better. They worked forward instead of backward and solved it in less time. And they did the same thing with endocrinology. The endocrinology professors had more chunks, more background knowledge, solved it better and quicker than the endocrinology interns. Okay. Did the endocrinologists have better, higher level thinking? Certainly in those areas they did. Now, what they did is they took the cardiology problems and gave them to the endocrinologists. And they gave the endocrinology problems to the cardiologists. Now what happened? They acted like novices. They were no better than, actually they were a little worse than novices. Because they took analogies from their field. So the cardiologists took cardiology analogies, applied it to endocrinology, and they were wrong. The point, I think, is the importance of background knowledge and the idea that you can't override background knowledge or get around background knowledge by saying we're teaching higher order thinking skills. They don't exist out of, even if they do, they can't, no matter how brilliant someone is at analogies, and logic problems and all that, it doesn't help if you don't have the background knowledge. Okay? And that's what the research on information processing is showing. Would you put on the next slide, please? The next slide. We've had all this. Hold it, way at the bottom. Yeah. Okay. Instructional support, bring the whole thing. Okay, instructional support, bring the whole thing up. Because of the a main point here is the limitations of our working memory, as you well know. Sitting in a lecture yesterday, there's a limit in how much the working memory can process, can take in at any one time. Okay, it gets swamped. Okay, so what do we do to help people, help students, help others because of that limitation? You see, the notion is you provide support, okay? And here are supports. You provide an outline or an overview so that you can focus on where you're going. By the way, one of the problems with constructivist approaches, particularly asking kids, is that the kids, particularly the lower kids, can't distinguish the relevant from the irrelevant. And they frequently pick up on the irrelevant because now an outline helps focus, helps reduce that irrelevancy. Okay? Teaching material in small steps. I don't know why any presenter doesn't do what I do. I mean, there's a limit to how much one can take, and the small steps applies here. The concept of teaching in small steps was learned, actually Jerry Brophy came up with the notion. It came from his analysis of the research on effective teaching. This is what, and when I get to it, the Milwaukee, particularly these recent teachers in Milwaukee, I saw they taught, they modeled, they taught, they practiced. They modeled, taught, practiced. It was always model, teach, practice. That small step sequence is what was going on in all of their classes. I've been in classes where that's done, and you see this, the kids are just having, because they're successful. One of the things that comes up, and I wrote in the effect, is the importance of a high success rate. Well, one way of obtaining this high success rate is teaching in small steps. This is, but it comes, not only does it come from the teachers, you see, but it comes from this basic research on the limitations of our working memory, on the need to process material before we put it into our long-term memory. Active participation. Active participation refers to this processing. The processing that we go, this is where you say, to say it in your own words, this is what what homework is supposed to do. This is what talking to your neighbor, this is what reviews do. All these things which help us act upon the knowledge so that it's coded in our long-term memory and becomes more accessible. D, provide for over-learning. When something, by over-learning, we don't know how many times you have to teach it. By over-learning, we mean it's readily accessible. The point about, it's not only phonics decoding, you see, that has to be taught, but it's decoding to the point where it's done automatically. You don't have to stop and sound out the word. This is another reason why vocabulary becomes important. When a kid is reading, they have to stop and puzzle out the word, then the working memory becomes, more pieces of the limited working memory have to be used, and fewer pieces can be used for comprehension. But if you're going through it automatically, so that you don't have to think about the words, or at our level, you don't have to think about the meaning of certain vocabulary in it, or at our level, okay, then there's more room that's available for comprehension. I tend to write in short sentences. If a sentence of mine is 3 lines long, I start cutting. I have friends who write a whole page. The reason I work very hard at that is because when we read a long sentence, our eyes wander, Our mind can't take it in. It's too much, too many things you have to hold in your head before you can get to the meaning, okay? Now, the more overlearning you have in an area, if it's an old area, then we can handle the long sentences because we have the background knowledge. This overlearning becomes important in review. There's some beautiful little cards that Patton has produced that are available outside, and one of them is on frequent testing. And they're all good. The one on testing, the one on success, the one on guiding practice, on active participation, they're all good. And the overlearning part, the review, all that kind of stuff, the purpose of all that is so that things become automatic. So math and knowledge and names and places and all these become automatic. And this is why when we get to the more effective teachers, they're spending more time in review. So that's it. Caution. So the research says there's an importance for review, there's an importance for overlearning. But in a recent study where they looked at the high-achieving teachers and the low-achieving teachers, some of the low-achieving teachers spent 30 minutes in review. So yes, there's an importance for review, but no, you're not supposed to spend the whole period on it. So it becomes a dilemma for you as supervisors. You tell teachers, review's important, overlearning's important, but please don't spend 30 minutes doing it. So it's that balance that comes out of this research. Next. All right. We'll go right down. What you see here, way at the top. Can you get the top one there? Okay. Implications for practice. Many of these we've had before. Provide organizing structures. This is in your book, the work that Ellis and Kozloff are giving. They are loaded with organizing structures that people can use to get new information. Concept maps. There's a great idea because it helps students, all these scaffolds, it helps students develop the material. Provide for student processing by asking them to explain the material, to summarize, to apply. All this becomes necessary. Go on. Okay. So all these ideas derive not from classroom teaching necessarily, but from the research on human cognitive processing. Now, in the next section, I'm going to be talking about classrooms. And you're going to see that that classroom teachers do the same thing. We use words like direct instruction and explicit teaching and systematic teaching, but what we mean is the effective teachers were doing this explicit teaching and this systematic teaching. Okay? The less effective teachers were doing it poorly. We're not doing it systematically. So I wish we had a word that would apply to the superior teaching and could distinguish the superior teaching from the everyday teaching. We end up with words like explicit teaching, which was meant to refer to the superior teaching, and then it gets generalized to everyone. So when I'm really want to talk about the superior teaching, the teaching that led to the highest achievement. Okay? And I will go on and say, and I'll talk about that, in 1999, 2000, there was a new study in Milwaukee, again, of the high-achieving and the low-achieving teachers. Okay? And what came out, and I'll talk about that, was this same pattern and more. So there's nothing invalid about this pattern in this new study, well-done study, 20 years later. And what we see here is what they did. This is systematic teaching, as you've heard about it. This is the so-called direct instruction that people castigate. This is this terrible teacher-dominated theory. I mean, once the romantics start, there's no end. But this is it. And what comes up, what came out in the Milwaukee study was how loving and caring and concerned these teachers were. When I would talk about this stuff to teachers, and frequently they came up to me and said, "Thank you for saying that systematic, well-organized teachers are also concerned about kids and also care about kids." Actually, it's because of the care that this comes out. So here is the general pattern that emerged not from academic research, but from the teachers themselves. And it's been replicated in Milwaukee recently. Okay, let's see it. Okay, now we can kind of go down the sections. We'll start with, we can do it. Review. There's nothing new about the review that didn't come out. In fact, there's nothing here that wasn't in the information processing research, which is why I say convergent. There's the review. And they would spend 4, 5, 6 minutes reviewing numbers, letters, facts, previous learning, whatever it was. And sometimes they'd review the vocabulary that had to be used for the story, you see. But then again, one of these Milwaukee teachers spent 30 minutes on review. And this is one of the complaints. So this is the balance here. Next. All the way down. All the way, there you go, under guided practice. Okay. What comes out in these schools, in these classrooms, is this mixture of presentation and guided practice. And the only way to express it is with these arrows. It isn't there's presentation and then there's guided practice. The poor ones did that. There's presentation mixed with guided practice. Of course, the stating of lesson goals. Of course, the detailed instructions. But there we have the teaching in small steps. And if I were to say, what do I like you to, of course it's all there in the article, what do I like you to take out of this research? Sort of, one of them would be the importance of small steps so that, the mind doesn't get overworked, what I'm trying to do in this setting. Okay. Guiding practice by providing, and here I'll come up with more later, providing models, thinking aloud, working examples, supervising students as they did the examples. This Madeline Hunter introduced the concept of guided practice to the education world, and I'm forever thankful. We're forever thankful for her contribution there. Asking questions, checking for understanding becomes, there's this little handout, little thing called response cards. And it's a wonderful way of checking for understanding that was developed by Patton and provide for response. And here we see the importance of a high success rate. And so what would I have you remember? The importance of small steps and the importance of a high success rate. Now, we've all been in classrooms, where 3 or 4 kids give the answer, the rest are confused, and the teacher goes on. And by teaching in small steps, when you've seen it, the success rate becomes high. And there's and this is what the master teachers, the systematic teachers, were doing it. Okay. And sometimes it's a real one. How to obtain a high success rate is an issue that has not been adequately studied. And if anyone out here is looking for a paper, a dissertation, a master's thesis, or have we need more specific information on what master teachers are doing to get a high success rate. what I would recommend is you find, you all know these master teachers, okay? And what I would recommend, and I'm going to do it myself, I'm going to do it with some, is you ask them, how do you obtain a high success rate? And they write it down. You talk to them about it. And then someone sits in the back of the classroom and observes how they're doing it and talk back and forth. And what I think, this is what they call qualitative research, but it's a case study of known effective, known high-achieving teachers. And what I would love to read more of, and I think it'd be important to give to teachers more of, is what are these master teachers specifically doing to obtain this high success rate? Okay? We know they're teaching us, and we don't have a literature on that. It's difficult, particularly when you have the slower kids in the classroom, you have the students with disabilities in the classroom. What is being done to obtain a high success rate with these kids? We know they do it. There's not enough on it. Now, in this Milwaukee study, they were able to locate 8 teachers who were consistently high achieving in reading and math for 2 years, and 5 low. And I'm going to go up, as soon as the weather gets a little better so I can go jogging in the Milwaukee forest, I'm going to go up to Milwaukee and visit these teachers because they're still teaching, sit and talk to them about this subject. And I hope that more people do it. But this is sort of the essence, this small step guided practice mixture. Next. Up. Move the whole thing up so we can have it in the center. Okay. Provide systematic feedback and corrections is what we have. The literature is really not sufficient on this. Clearly it's important, but I don't think there's enough information on how feedback is working in these classrooms. It's simply not enough. Okay. Independent practice. Provide explicit instruction and practice for seat work exercises. What the effective teachers were doing, of course, is they would work the seat work exercises with the students before they began the seat work. There was direct instruction in the seat work before the kids ran out to do it. Okay? The less effective teachers, they would assign the seat work prematurely. I remember this teacher, she was teaching multiplication and she didn't do it too well and didn't have a high success rate, and then gave the kids the seat work and she's running around reteaching it. And then there was chaos here. The more effective teachers provided this explicit instruction in the seat work exercises. I was once in a classroom where the whole class was working on the homework. And they did the first problem together, and there was confusion. And they did the second problem together, and there was confusion. And the teacher said, "Do not do this homework." Partly because, and Ellis mentioned this, partly because we being rational, we figure if we don't know it, we figure out a way to make the problem work. You end up with a misconception, and now it's going to be hell getting rid of that. So human rationality can easily lead to misconceptions, and therefore there's a need to provide that. So, and finally, of course, the monthly reviews, which make sense because of the need to get the overlearning, get the automaticity, get it working out. Now, from this whole sheet, I've sort of selected 4 elements which I think are manageable and worth talking about when you're working with teachers and when you're talking about instruction. And they are, as I've summarized in the paper, teaching small amounts at once, providing for guided practice, obtaining a high success rate, and obtaining extensive practice. And the response, everything here, error correction, time trials, and response cards sort of works in that area. In 1995 and on, Alex Molnar and John Zaharak at University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee decided to study small classes. And they got the funds so that they could look at 21 schools where the classrooms were 1 to 15. And as control, 17 schools where the classrooms were 30 to 1. Mm-hmm. And they observed this for 3 years now. What did they find? They found that at the end of grade 1, small classes, okay, and small classes had higher, you might want to write this down. I don't have the URL for this study, but I'll tell you how to find it through Google. Okay? It's called the Student Achievement Guarantee in Education, or SAGE. So you put SAGE into Google. You have, this is my opening one. You found it. Oh, I love you. There it is. There it is. Oh, thank you. Okay. That's the whole URL. But if you're lazy, you go to Google, you put in SAGE, you put in CERAI, and it'll be there. And then they have the 2001 study. And this is the one that's based on 2nd and 3rd grade. As part of the study, they identified 8 teachers in grades 2 and 3 who got, okay. This study was conducted the same way as the other ones I talked about. I'm sorry, oof, I'm all confused. Okay, back to 1st grade. They found that at the end of 1st grade, students in the small classrooms were doing better, significantly better, as measured by the adjusted test scores and the linear hypothesis analysis, than students in the control, 30 to 1. During 2nd grade, both groups made progress, but the small groups were not superior to the regular 2nd grade. During 3rd grade, both groups made progress, but the small classes were not superior to the 3rd grade. At the end of 3rd grade, those who had the small classes were superior to those who had those students who were in the larger classes. What happened was the effect at the end of 1st grade remained, so that at the end of 3rd grade they were still superior, even though there were no differences in 2nd and 3rd grade. Is that clear? Let me explain again, okay? There were differences in 1st grade, and they were permanent differences. So that by the end of 3rd grade, even though there were no differences in 2nd and 3rd grade, they were still superior. Okay? And what John Zaharak and his students did was identify 8 teachers whose classrooms were high achieving in 2 years, in both reading and math. They found some teachers who were high 1 year and low the next in reading, who were high in reading and low in math. But they found 8 teachers who were high in both for 2 years. And this came out in this study, published, it's not published, but it went on the web in December of 2001. And I just found it, and I got real excited. They also found 5 teachers who were consistently below in both grades, for the same period. Okay. Now, when they began this, and I'm quoting now with my edit from the SAGE report. SAGE stands for Student Achievement Guarantees in Education, which is just playing around to try to get SAGE. Okay. When they began this study, the researchers expected that reduced class size would lead to more student self-direction, more student thinking, more hands-on activities. They expected that these hands-on activities would lead to more student achievement. After all, they did this study, began this study in 1996, part of the heyday of hands-on, part of the heyday of this movement. This is what they believe. This is Alex Mulder still loved. This is what they expected. You can see where I'm going. That was not what they found. The investigators found that all 8 of the higher achieving teachers based their primary teaching on explicit instruction. These teachers gave clear directions, explained concepts, modeled procedures, required practice, provided feedback, and supported student learning. Their lessons consisted of carefully planned activities with clear goals, logical structure, and step-by-step content progression. I'm quoting. These lessons proceeded at a brisk pace. These lessons were often presented with enthusiasm, energy, and a commitment, sometimes a fierce commitment to student accomplishment. Most of these classrooms were schools where 60 to 90% of the students were on free or reduced lunch. A fierce commitment. There were times when a teacher would digress from a lesson, but these times were rare. After the basic foundation was built, some of these teachers would then engage their students in more experiential learning, using authentic tasks and challenging problems. But this experiential learning routinely followed more teacher-centered instruction. It occurred after students had acquired a firm grasp of the targeted knowledge or skills. For higher achieving teachers, explicit teaching is used first and more frequently than experiential learning. In some, the more effective teachers believe in the importance of acquiring basic learning as a first priority. They also believe that the most effective way for students to acquire basic learning is to explicitly teach them rather than to have them discover through problem-solving activities. The more effective teachers did not neglect experiential learning, but they believe it is more effective after the students have acquired fundamental skills and knowledge. Finally, this is new. This kind of material was not available to us when the earlier research that I talked about was done. There's an image here of a funnel where at the beginning there's constrained, and as people move up, then there's more activities. But even this, the activities are supervised, are carefully planned. Not all 8 teachers had this experiential teaching, but a lot of them did, and these teachers are still teaching, and I hope to go in and see them. More about these teachers, but let me go on. Most of the lower achieving teachers also used explicit teaching. Terrible with the word. But in these classrooms, the pace of the lessons was quite slow. The lessons began with a lengthy directions or explanations. Transitions were frequently missing or awkward. Concepts at skill were examined at extraordinary length rather than presented in reviews. The actions of many of the lower achieving teachers they were warm, they were sweet, but they said the actions lacked enthusiasm or diligence. They did not see the sense of commitment and an expectation that all students will achieve that they saw in the classrooms of the higher achieving teachers. I'll give a few examples, but these teachers would sit and one of them said, and it's sort of, This is teacher L3, low 3. Teacher was consistently gentle, kind, and soft. L3 preferred exercises consisting of a minimum amount of work spread out over a long period of class time. You know that teacher. I've seen those teachers, and that's the difference. Okay. Classroom management. And they were able to combine both classroom management. When we were doing this, we're doing this research in the 70s, there was also some extensive work on classroom management, but it was almost separate. The very best work on classroom management has been done by Carolyn Evertson, Evertson. And if you look up Evertson classroom management in Google, you'll get the reference. She has books on elementary and junior high. What Evertson did was they had lots of money in Texas in those days, send out observers to observe the first minute of school for some 20 teachers. And the observers recorded exactly what the teacher was doing all day long for the first month. At the end of the semester, they looked at engaged time on task in these 20 classrooms and found a big difference. You had high on task places and low on task. So they went back to their notes and said, what were the teachers who had high on task doing the first day, the second day? And what were the other ones doing the first day and the second? And they wrote this up, they summarized all this, and they've been revising it, and it's in their books. Classroom Management is the title, and it's classroom management in both elementary and secondary. And what they found was that these teachers started explicitly teaching classroom rules, classroom practice, the first minute of the first day. In fact, some of them spent the first 3 hours just doing that. And these teachers who did that were the ones who had fewer management problems during the rest of the year. In the Milwaukee study, they also focused on management. And what I'm going to say here is just repeating almost what Carolyn found 15 years ago. The higher achieving teachers had well-established rules, routines, and reward systems. The teachers were firm, decisive, consistent, and fair. Some teachers gave students more independence, but this independence was part of a comprehensive scheme. The structured management procedures of the high-achieving teachers led to an increase in instructional time, and the teachers had more time, therefore, to devote to individual students. All reduced size, remember, this is done in classrooms of 15 to 1. All reduced size teachers focused on individual students, but the higher achieving teachers were able to give more time to individual students because of their management procedures that were set, routine, and established. The lower achieving teachers also had rules and routines, but these teachers were positive and fair, but they appeared to be overly concerned with maintaining order. They would often dwell on misbehavior, be excessively concerned with noise, and interrupt their students waiting. These students were notable in their inability to implement their student management plan. Because of their inability, less time was available for instruction in their classrooms. So this is sort of another major difference. I like to sort of quote some of the practices of the two groups of teachers. Teacher H1. Explicit teaching, modeling, and extensive practicing of skills were important and regular components of all lessons. Instructional methods include frequent checking for understanding. The teacher used whiteboards that the kids wrote on. The teacher said that in order to do problem solving or critical thinking, you had to have fundamental knowledge. She said, "You've got to have the building blocks in order to build in our house." Teacher H2. Explicit teaching was a dominant feature of lessons in both reading and math. It was common for her to say, "I'm going to model what I want you to do. I'm going to show you step by step." Instruction was but there was freedom in variety in student responses. Teacher H5. She frequently checks for student progress, both formally and informally. She insists on frequent reviews. But much of her awareness comes because of her style, includes constant interactions with the students. Some of the low teachers. During an hour-long reading class, for example, each student read just one short passage and answered one question. Throughout, L3 always had all students do the same work and the same time. Even sharpening pencils took a long time, as L3 had students line up at her desk as she sharpened each of their pencils. You've seen these teachers. I don't know, the pacing, this is L2, the pacing activities was characterized by spending 1/3 or more of the instructional time on startup activities rather than processing a new school. In an effort to ensure each student's understanding, the pace of instruction was slowed down to accommodate one student at the expense of the entire class. A vocabulary practice of words for a new story took up a whole lesson. The students were given a sheet of 25 or more words and asked to study the words while she dealt with a student in the hall. Next, students were called on to read each word aloud. The students were told to highlight the word. The teacher walked around. One class lesson spent on learning 25 words. So there's, a major difference between the more effective and the less effective. The commitment, the organization, the progression, okay, and this going on. As I read about the low teachers, I don't know what to do. I don't know what could be done. In many ways, it's because of the problems with the low teachers that people go to more structured stuff, although I don't know what you people know. I don't know what can be done with these low. These, by the way, are not new teachers. Okay, L3, 15 years teaching. L1, 5 years teaching. 14 years teaching. 3.5 years teaching, and 30 years teaching. So, okay, all right. We pause again for the survey. What we have so far is the consistency between the 1970, between the cognitive processing research and the teacher effects research, and a lovely an expectation in Milwaukee that teachers would use this reduced time to go into project methods and hands-on, and that's not what they did. There were experiential lessons. There was a time when, for instance, they had to measure the tensile strength of spaghetti using washers, and spaghetti was flying around the room. This stuff was going on. But then as soon as it was over, the kids knew what to do next, and they sat down in their seat. They sat down in their seat, and they started writing up what the spaghetti was. And it was organized. I was once in a classroom in New Mexico, and I was saying that I wanted to see, how the class ended. So I was in that classroom. It is now 2:30. Actually, it was now 2:25. And I know school's going to end at 2:30. Teacher is teaching away. And I'm saying, I got to watch this. At 2:28, teacher said, "Okay, you know what? Get ready to go home." Each kid stopped, put their stuff away, put their stuff inside, put a chair, put the chair on their desk, got their stuff lined up, were ready to say, and the teacher stood at the door, said goodbye to every kid, hugged a number of kids, and they went by. And I had my stopwatch. I'm going away 2 minutes, and it was done. And that's what can be done in a that was this well-organized, well-managed classroom. So we have this contrast, on the other, but we have this consistency.